Welcome to Athlete Students, the podcast where we always talk about sports, but in an educated way that may surprise some people. My name is Megan Jensen, and I am a senior sport management and public relations major at McKendree, and I'm becoming a scholar in intercultural communication. Yes, that's right.
Wow.
My co-host is Shaylee Florine, a senior sport management major. And Shaylee and I are both nerds, so we're excited to get to talk to you all today. We love talking about sports and the reasoning behind the way we think about sports and athletes. So we're going to unpack some of the dominant ways of thinking and really explain why things are the way they are. So hopefully you will learn some stuff today and think of sports in a new way. So let's start things off with a voicemail.
Let's.
Hi, Megan and Shelley. This is Bob Barkerson. I was wondering who you guys think is the strongest athlete of all time. Thank you in advance.
Thank you, Bob. So my mind automatically jumps to male athletes. The LeBron James, the Michael Jordans, Bryce Harper, J.J. Watt, OBJ, the list goes on and on. So me and Shaylee really want to talk to you guys about why this is the way this is. So we're going to unpack this. So a lot of what we believe about sports and athletes come from the media. And since we've spent 4 years kind of studying the sport management world and the media's impact on that, we think it's important to share what we learned about media representations of athletes in sports.
Yeah. So one of the best articles we've read on media representations of male athletes is Nick Trujillo's Hegemonic Masculinity on the Mound and Media Representations of Nolan Ryan in American Sports Culture. He uses Connell's definition of hegemonic masculinity and defines it as the culturally idealized form of masculine character, which just emphasizes the connecting of masculinity to toughness and competitiveness, as well as the subordination of women and marginalization of gay men. And I think that's still pretty present.
Yeah, so his research focused on how the media covered Nolan Ryan. And so he specifically focused on how hegemonic masculinity was being reproduced through the media coverage. So they did media analysis of Nolan Ryan, and they found that the media covered Nolan Ryan, through the lens of hegemonic masculinity by focusing on physical force and control. So he was really described as like a power pitcher, and those were kind of trends that continued out his career. And then they also talked about his occupational achievement. So they really were focused on emphasizing his work ethic and how hard he worked to get to the position that he was at. And he also talked about familial patriarchy, and just that like he was an actual father, so they covered that, and that he was like a symbolic father to like his teammates and kind of the community that he was in. And then also they talked about frontiersmanship, so that they really talked about how he was like covered as like a Wild West cowboy, and like due to his Texas roots and pitching in Texas, and that was really something that they focused on. And then finally they really focused on his heterosexuality, and just the fact that he was, quote, one of the most handsomest men in sport. And they talked about his wife as well a lot, so that was just reinforcing that. Shaylee, can you think of any examples of these 5 things in sport today?
I think one of the things that I automatically jump to, I know classic like Packers fan here, but I always think of like the Brett Favre and like the Levi's commercials that are like similar, because they all show Brett Favre like outside doing outdoorsy man things, like playing football with his kids and playing fetch with the dog, like. And I think you see that like familial patriarchy with like him and his family, and like the frontiersmanship of like he's out in nature, like doing these things. And I think it just like has this classic all-American man like persona. And I think that's pretty similar to the article that we talked about.
Yeah, and I definitely think like that is the type of male athlete that we want in society, and that's what is covered more. And I think that kind of the media coverage really does reinforce and reproduce those ideas that, you know, it's patriarchy and masculinity that are what dominates US culture. So kind of moving on from that, one of the most masculine sports, and you just talked about Brett Favre with football, and like the media representations of Nolan and Brett Favre, we see masculinity as one of the key parts in the NFL. And I think football has really been a long-standing example of masculinity in sport and in the media. And so a similar study, Anderson and Keon's examining media contestation of masculinity and head trauma in the NFL. And this looked at Aaron Rodgers, another Green Bay Packer, and him removing himself from a game after taking a blow to the head. And the authors argued that the way that this was covered in the media was something that was okay. And I think these actions were okay because of we were becoming more aware at the time of CTE and head trauma, and it was seen as more of a courageous act that he was taking himself out of the game. And I think we just kind of are more aware that football is more dangerous than we actually think it is. And so just they were okay with him taking him out. So Shelley, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think like CTE and concussions and all that protocol is like a rising conversation in the NFL. And I think there's like a tough complex with it, and we don't have to dive too much into it, but I think there's like, we are becoming more aware of CTE and concussion related issues, but that doesn't necessarily mean like we're going to stop watching. I know like I'm kind of that way. With that said, I do think that like the media responds differently to a situation like this depending on the athlete and the situation, but I'll let you unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, so what I see here is an element of race. And I think like reading through the article, it seemed to me that like we would be okay with a white quarterback being worried about his health. But I don't think we would feel the same way if it was a black athlete and a black quarterback. And I think like that is something that is being reproduced through media a lot is, you know, the white athlete is the hard worker, the black athlete is, you know, just there based on his skills and strengths. And I think it reminded me of the article we read about the implicit bias in the NFL, and just the fact that like there is racial discrimination that is occurring in the NFL, and we think about white athletes and black athletes in the NFL so differently, and it goes on in the draft, starts in the draft process and kind of continues without even being noticed by most people. Shelly, you've read that article, so do you have any kind of key points out of there too?
Yeah, I think the article was super eye-opening because I think it's something that like kind of goes on, and we like to say that we know we're aware of it, but then you read an article like this and it kind of dives in deeper. It's been like a whole semester since we read it, but I definitely remember some of the key points. I think like one of the biggest things they talked about is how coaches and scouts interact when scouts come to look at certain players. The article kind of talked about how, in reference to a black athlete, the scout almost always starts off by asking something like, which of his parents should we talk to? Is his father around? What's his home life like? Like that kind of thing. Versus with a white athlete, the initial questions are more about like the game and what's this player's personality like and how are their skill set. And then they kind of translated that even further into like, kind of like you touched on, how the media covers athletes of different races, because we almost always talk about white athletes as, well, they're so smart and they can see the field or the court really well, and their skill set is really developed. Whereas when we talk about Black athletes, we talk about, well, they're so powerful and explosive and athletic. And it's just interesting to see like the different ways in which they talk about that. And I even noticed it some like with the NFL draft last night, just like the way that they were talking about different prospects and the way that they're talked about once they did get picked by a team based on even like position. We expect players of certain race to play different positions. So those were just some of my key takeaways from the article. I think it's still super prevalent in pretty much all media sports coverage today.
Yeah, and I definitely think like masculinity is still going to be the main thing in the NFL for as long as the NFL survives. I think the article about Aaron Rodgers is trying to contest that some, but I think that masculinity is one of the key parts of the NFL, because you've always got the people that are like, oh, they're making the league too soft, or, you know, it's just different than what it was because of all this. And like, I think masculinity is what makes the NFL. And I think then it's interesting that even in like the dominant ideology of masculinity, then there are the kind of different media representations of that masculinity. So I think like if you go back to like the Nolan Ryan, and like I think white players are going to be perceived more as like the frontiersman and the family man, and then you have different ways that of masculinity that is shown kind of for the Black players. So I think that's just kind of the interesting points with that.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to add, or we can move on to the next voicemail?
I will say that like I kind of agree with how you touched on like how white players are typically viewed as like the frontiersmanship, and they talk about different ways that black athletes demonstrate that like masculinity. Like with the draft last night, like there were several instances where like when a white athlete was drafted, they talked about like their, I don't even know how to describe it, but like they were depicted like just doing things around the house with their family. And then there was one particular Black athlete that was drafted where they told the classic story of like his life was super hard growing up and he's come up from nothing. Like, and I think that's just very like there's a lot of, it doesn't matter about race. Like there's so many players in the NFL who have been dealt with like difficult situations, white or Black, it doesn't matter. But I think they like typically save those stories for like the Black athletes to kind of talk about, like just to show that they've beat all the odds and everything.
Yeah, and that goes back to the American dream, and that
right,
we think that that can happen. So okay, so let me get this voicemail pulled up that I already started to play. Whoops.
Hi, Shelly and Megan. My name is Kevin Bacon, and I have a daughter who plays on a club traveling basketball team. And I was wondering what you guys think about spending all these thousands of dollars on the team. You know, like how beneficial is it going to be for her to play at this higher level, and if it's worth the money? All right, thank you in advance.
That's a good question. So for me, like, I just think it's crazy how much money some people spend on sports. And like, my family was one of those people that spent a lot of money on sport, but like, there are people that spend more money on sport. But I think it really just is part of American culture. And I think probably a lot of people don't even realize that like sport is affected by your social class. I think that's probably something that like just really goes unlooked or overlooked. But I think it's really interesting, and I think we probably as America think that anyone can play sports and anyone can you know, fulfill the American dream and that ideology of dominance, and kind of relate that back to why we kind of focus on sports and why we spend so much money on them. We believe as Americans that sports teach us all these lessons, and those in the middle and upper class are willing to spend money, thousands of dollars, on sports for kids so that they can become dominant in them and enjoy those together, and kind of reach that American dream, starting from the middle and upper classes, which is interesting in and of itself. And I think then we look at people in the lower class and we say, well, why don't you just play a sport? And then you can kind of work your way up and get out of those hard conditions, because if you become a NFL player, then you'll be able to support for your family. So we read a little bit about this in Sports Soc and Coakley's article on social class and do money and power matter in sports. And I think they bring up a really good couple of points on social class in sport. So just to touch on a few of them, exclusive golf clubs kind of use this class ideology that really legitimizes their right to kind of have their memberships and have that privilege that they have of being like the top in society. So when you can buy into a golf club, then you are at the top and you've reached kind of being a winner. And then I think like the one quote in the book, sports offer proof that inequalities are based on merit, that competition identifies winners, and that losers should work harder or change themselves if they want to be winners, or simply get back up and try again. Sports provide a metaphor for society that portrays social class as a characteristic of individuals rather than an economic structure that influences life chances and distribution of resources. So I think like basically kind of summarizing that, like sports are like proof that inequalities exist. And I think one of the inequalities in America is social class. And I think we as sports fans, or we as Americans, kind of see sports as a way to get out of that, and we don't take into consideration all the things that are also fighting against that. So what are your thoughts on kind of these 2 points?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, like you said, Mr. Bacon brings up a very good question, because I too like did the AAU basketball and the club volleyball when I was younger, like, and even then, like, I didn't join those things until I was in high school, and I was like kind of late to the game. Like kids are starting travel teams in the off season now, like I don't even know how early, like fourth, fifth, sixth grade, like maybe even earlier. And
yeah.
so for me to not even join to high school, like I understood at the time how big of a financial commitment that was. And I can't even like wrap my brain around like the idea of people starting these travel sports at second grade or even before. And I think like you bring up a really good point that like it is such a financial commitment, and we like to sell this idea that like kind of like you said, everyone can be great at sports if they just work hard enough and they just try their best. But like the reality is there are a lot of people who might not ever have the opportunities to put their skills out there. They might be the most skilled athlete in the world, but if they can't afford the absurd prices to start playing AAU basketball at the age of 7, then that's a lot tougher road than we like to sell it as.
Yeah.
So
And
I just think it's interesting how important that is to our culture.
Yeah, and I think like
Go ahead.
we don't take into consideration then all of the other things that are kind of working against those people that are in lower social classes, that then we think like we see the LeBrons coming from a single family household and a lower income area, and like we think, oh, everybody can kind of do that if they, but not everyone's LeBron. Like not everyone's
Yeah.
gonna be able to go directly into the NBA and kind of skip getting into a college. And I think
Hmm.
that is another aspect that is just, we don't think about those other characteristics that kind of affect people in different social classes. Um, Kind of to piggyback
Yeah,
off
I
that,
agree.
so I read an article called Get Off the Sofa and Go Play, and it looked at family and socioeconomic influences on physical activity of 10 and 11-year-old kids. And basically what they found was that middle and high SES school children were like encouraged to be active in like proactive ways. So like their families would like actually get up and go play with them, or they were supported financially to play a sport, or they were taken to their soccer practice or basketball practice, or they then kind of had that encouragement, but it was actually like people, their parents were doing something about it. And that's
Hmm.
versus children in lower SES schools received more of like a verbal encouragement, and cost was more of a barrier to them. So their parents would be like, hey, like, why don't you go play outside? And like, versus the other kids in the middle and high SES schools where they were being taken to a soccer practice. And those kids at the lower SES level were more of, go run around outside, because cost was a barrier or logistics were a barrier to get those kids to those practices. So,
Hmm.
what are your kind of thoughts on this, Shay?
Yeah, I think that like that alone kind of just shows like how fast those gaps can be created in terms of like development of being physically active and like having that kind of lifestyle. Because if a 10-year-old sparks an interest in a sport, but their parents don't maybe have the means to put them on a team or take them to a practice or have, pay for them to get lessons in that sport, like that interest in that sport might quickly burn out because they're like, if they can't have the means to play that sport, then we might never know if that child could have been a fantastic athlete or anything like that. And so it really just kind of puts this barrier and this delay on the ability for members of lower SES to join in that physical active lifestyle, because by the time they might be old enough to have the means to explore a sport that they like or something like that, like all the members of middle and higher SES statuses have been playing that sport for years. And so I think it just very quickly shows a gap and like allows for differences in the ability to have access to that sport.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me, like, I think in sports Soch we talked about like how most NBA players are from like middle and high class. Like when you look at the percentages, and I'm not sure like what they actually are, like most of them come
Mm-hmm.
from middle or higher classes because they have those resources to have to spend the money on training or go to the basketball practices, even if isn't at the highest level. I mean, you have kids
Yeah,
that aren't even able to be on a basketball team until it's school sponsored and it's right after school.
yeah. And I also think that this is a good way a good like quick way to talk about how we kind of have these ideas of who plays what sport, and you can break it down by each sport, and we don't have to break it down by each individual sport, but we can kind of touch on like the fact that certain sports are easier for low SES people to access, because I can go outside and throw a football with my friends for relatively like zero cost. I can find a basketball hoop somewhere and a couple of friends and play a pickup game of basketball. But if I'm a member of low socioeconomic status, I'm not going to be able to just find some skates and hockey gear and go skating on a random ice rink. Like, I'm not going to just have a random ability to go do things like that. So I think this is also a good way to kind of look at how lower socioeconomic status people can still kind of find ways to play those cheaper sports per se, but like that's where you kind of see a divide in certain sports just cost a lot more to participate in, and so it just kind of depends on the access that you have.
Yeah. And I think like that goes back to the idea that like we think sports offer a way for everyone to be involved and everyone to kind of get that teaching that sports provide, but when in reality sports are really showing the divide that is in America, whether it be social class or race or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything else to add, Shaylee?
I don't think so. Feel free to leave us a voicemail.
That's all we have for today. We hope you enjoyed our discussions on the media representations of athletes and the implications of gender and race in those media representations, and then the relationship between social class and sports. I think we can challenge those ideologies that kind of come along with race, gender, social class in sport. But I think what me and you both struggle with is kind of how can we be involved in sport and love sport and watch sport but not reinforce those ideologies. And I think we can do this by just understanding more of the way or why things are the way they are. Do you have anything you'd like to add on that, Shay?
I mean, basically what you said. Honestly, like, it sounds so nerdy, and like I've had to do it for my classes anyway, but like I just think like reading these types of articles that kind of challenge those beliefs, and just like you said, like being aware, it just changes the way that you consume sport. And like just now when I watch sports, like I'm more aware of the societal norms that are in place, and like I'm able to kind of make that distinction in my head, and it changes the way I consume sports, and it just changes the way like I talk about sports with other people. And I think that's just the most important thing you can do, is just be informed and be aware.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the more and more people are aware of how this kind of all interacts, I think then we will be able to kind of challenge the way things are. And so that will be where we really do produce change. So
and watch women's sports. Watch the WNBA.
That's true.
Do that.
That's very important. So thank you for joining us today on Athlete Students. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and understand a bit more on why we think the way we do about sports.
Yes.
Okay, we are recording, but I can edit this out.
Woot. Did it.
Okay, honestly, we crushed that.
We really did.
How do I stop recording?